Hello, my name is Sharon Walker, and I was asked by the Historical Society in Cedar Falls, Iowa, to do a presentation on crazy quilts in conjunction with their current exhibit. Following the presentation, there will be another video from the International Quilt Museum in Lincoln, Nebraska, with an option for you to watch called Crazy Quilts, Mad Women. I hope to share with you three things: a brief historical background of the times in which the crazy quilt first appeared, a personal crazy quilt from my husband's paternal grandmother, and a brief example of how crazy quilts were made. Up until the Civil War, what has been called the cult of domesticity existed. Women were judged by four cardinal virtues: piety, purity, domesticity, and submissiveness. First to her father, then her husband, and then her son. A woman was to be skilled in all household duties and provide a happy place for the men in her life so they wouldn't be tempted to seek a good time elsewhere. This cult was espoused by all society, women included, and especially by the middle class. It gave women respect. She was the flag bearer for truth and integrity, not interested in politics, because everyone knew politics was corrupt. After the Civil War, with the advent of the Industrial Age, which was exemplified at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, many societal changes were happening. Agriculture still played an important role, as did the farm wife, but other groups of women were emerging, especially the working class woman. Immigrant women could help support their family financially, and along with farm girls, they came to urban areas in droves, seeking employment. Working conditions were often exhausting, with long hours, little pay, and dangerous. Perhaps you remember the story of the radium girls who died from cancer because they licked the tip of their brush when they were making the dials on watches, or the garment factory fire in New York City, where 146 women died. During this same time period, the Gibson girl, who was idealized in the drawings of Charles Gibson, became a standard for many middle-class and upper-class women. And it's interesting to note the word girl. There were the hello girls who operated telephone switchboards, shop girls, radium girls, Navy girls as World War I approached, and the hired girl who worked on a farm. The Gibson girl upgraded the cult of domesticity. She was sophisticated, upper or middle class, fashionable with a wasp waist, and sexy. She could attend college, be well educated, hold a job, and did I mention be sexy? Supposedly, she wasn't interested in politics, but perhaps she confounded men just a little. I would like to share a couple of drawings with you, two by Charles Gibson. One of the drawings by Mr. Gibson is titled Woman, the Eternal Question, and if you will notice, her hair is in the shape of a question mark. Another drawing that he did is titled Parlor Games, but looking at the expression of the young man in the drawing, it is not the cards that he is thinking about. Finally, I'd like to share a photo of a life-size painting from a Paris hospital. They are studying here, the doctors in this group, a young woman who seems to be in a fit of hysteria. This was the time of Freud and the wandering womb and women who were fainting. And if I had to be in an 18-inch corset, I think I would be a little bit hysterical as well. But it is interesting to note that the only person in the picture that is half dressed is the young woman, and what her hysteria has to do with her exposing her chest, I have no idea. And then we have the suffragists who were interested in politics. They were often wealthy. Suffragists were often accused of being mannish or not feminine or lesbian, not Gibson girly enough. There were also many philanthropic organizations that were formed during this time. such as the General Federation of Women's Clubs, PEO, Junior League, and others. But this sets the stage for the boom of the crazy quilt. Up until now, the patchwork quilt had ruled from around 1750 to 1850. It is one of the oldest quilt forms and truly American. For frontier women, fabric was precious and not to be wasted. Every scrap was used. But the names of the quilts show how women still express their opinions and feelings and events in their lives. Crossroads to Texas, Dolly Madison's Star, Kansas Dust Storm, 5440 or Fight, which alluded to a dispute with Canada along our northern border. The crazy quilt was something entirely new. It proved the status of its maker, and the makers of these quilts were well-to-do. These were women who had the time and servants to do the household chores. This was the rise of the extravagant Victorian, the Vanderbilts and Rockefellers. The fabric was lush and expensive, and kits were often available. Unlike the utilitarian patchwork quilt, it was never meant to be used as a bedspread. It was thrown over the back of the settee in the parlor, where it could be admired by guests. It also had no filler for warmth, and its construction wastes fabric. But it was also a statement of the maker, her skill at handicrafts, and her feelings and opinions. You will have seen photos of the living rooms of these Victorian women, bric-a-brac filled with home decorations made from feathers, shells, beads. The Victorian house at the Cedar Falls Historical Society is an example of this Victorian household. I have been fortunate all my life to have been surrounded by strong women, and I have the quilts of two such women. These pictures show their different lifestyles. My maternal grandmother grew up on a farm on the Kansas plain. Her picture shows her in a plain cotton dress, and her quilt exemplifies the patchwork, utilitarian and not worth dating. But as a child, she could tell me where the fabric came from, perhaps a brother's shirt or a sister's dress. My husband's grandmother's life was entirely different. She has Gibson girl written all over her. You can only imagine the gown she must have been wearing for this photo. She married her cousin, who was 9 years her junior, and born to wealth that was lost in the Great Depression, she had the time to make the crazy quilt. But she still expressed her opinion. The quilt is dated 1893 and shows her presidential choice 30 years before women won the right to vote. I also love the owl, a symbol of wisdom. The word wisdom is a feminine word in many languages. The back and lace edging are not original, and I do not know when they were added or by whom. But I love the fact that the colors are still vibrant and the stitching is wonderful. There's such a variety and it's complicated. I'd like to take just a minute to show you how to make a crazy quilt. There were several different ways. One was more popular than the others. But anyway, this is the quilt that was made by my friend's grandmother sometime in the 1930s. And I also have two of things that my friend made. This piece happens to be made in wool. I love the texture and feel of it. And it also shows the skill of the seamstress in that she was able to do curved lines. She tried her hand at making a Christmas stocking, and these pieces she found in an antique store. The most common way to make a crazy quilt back in the day was by starting with a piece of muslin and then a centerpiece in the middle that very often had uneven sides to it to make it interesting. Once it was attached to the muslin, other pieces were eventually added. And these pieces could be sewn as a top stitch, or they could be sewn together underneath. The seam would not be showing anyway once the decorative stitches were used. Once the first piece was applied, then we had to even it off by following the straight line. And this is an example of where the waist comes in, and over here as well. And now we have two even sides, straight lines. Then your next piece could be added. And again, it would have been trimmed down to make a straight line. Excess fabric would have been cut off. And you would just keep going around and around the black centerpiece until you had the size that you wanted. Finally, the fun part would begin. You would be able to embellish it any way that you wanted to. Fancy stitches along the seam lines, and then whatever interested you in the center. Today's crazy quilts are a little bit easier to make. You do not need to use the muslin backing. You still have a centerpiece, but you can easily trim the pieces without having to be careful of the muslin back. And if you happen to have a handy dandy little square ruler, you can also use it to even up your edges or choose which way you wish to cut it to make it the most interesting. I must confess that a crazy quilt was not always one of my fondest quilt patterns, but since I did the historical background, it has become one of my favorite art forms. I would like to close with a poem written by Douglas Malloch in 1928. It's called A Crazy Quilt. They do not make them anymore, for quilts are cheaper at the store than woman's labor, though a wife men think the cheapest thing in life. But now and then a quilt is spread upon a quaint old walnut bed, a crazy quilt of those days that I am old enough to praise. Some woman sewed these points and squares into a pattern, like life's cares. Here's a velvet that was strong, the poplin that she wore so long, a fragment from her daughter's dress like her, a vanished loveliness. Old patches of such things as these, old garments and old memories. And what is life? A crazy quilt. Sorrow and joy and grace and guilt, with here and there a square of blue for some old happiness that we knew. And so the hand of time will take the fragments of our lives and make out of life's remnants as they fall a thing of beauty after all. Thank you for joining me today. I hope you found inspiration to make your own crazy quilt. And don't forget to watch the video from the International Quilt Museum, and do stop by the Historical Society to see the exhibits through mid-December. Thank you for coming. See you later.